I knew something was wrong the moment I saw Brenda Hutchinson standing on my driveway with a clipboard. Her face twisted into that particular expression of self-righteous fury that only HOA board members seem to master. It was a Tuesday morning in Mesa, Arizona, and I had just gotten back from my morning run. The desert sun was already heating up the pavement, and all I wanted was a cold shower and some breakfast. Instead, I got Brenda, the vice president of our Saguaro Heights Homeowners Association, looking like she was about to deliver news of a war crime. "Zack Morrison," she said, not bothering with pleasantries. "We need to talk about the unauthorized structures on your roof." I wiped sweat from my forehead and tried to figure out what she was talking about. "Unauthorized structures, the satellite dishes," she snapped, tapping her pen against the clipboard. "You have 4 of them mounted on your roof, and they're visible from the street. That's a clear violation of Section 7.3 of our HOA covenants." I blinked at her, still processing. "Those aren't my satellite dishes, Brenda. They belong to the neighbors." Her eyes narrowed like I had just confessed to murder. "Excuse me, the dishes. They're not mine. When I bought this house 3 years ago, there was already this weird setup where the previous owner let the neighbors mount their satellite equipment on my roof because my house sits on higher ground. Better line of sight to the satellites or something. I inherited the arrangement." Brenda's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's irrelevant. You own the property, which makes you responsible for any structures on it. The HOA board voted last night, and we're issuing you a formal violation notice. You have 2 weeks to remove all satellite dishes from your roof, or you'll face fines of $200 per day." "Hold on," I said, my brain finally catching up to the absurdity of this conversation. "You want me to remove satellite dishes that don't belong to me and that my neighbors are using?" "What I want," Brenda said, her voice dripping with condescension, "is for you to comply with the rules that everyone else in this community follows. We've had multiple complaints about the unsightly appearance of your roof. It's bringing down property values." "Who complained?" I asked, looking around at the other houses on my cul-de-sac. My property looked fine. Sure, there were a few satellite dishes on the roof, but they weren't exactly neon signs. "That's confidential," Brenda said. "You have 2 weeks. After that, the fines begin." She thrust a bright orange violation notice at me and turned on her heel, marching back to her white Lexus SUV parked at the curb. I stood there in my running shorts, holding the notice and feeling like I had just been hit by a truck. This was going to be a problem. After my shower, I walked next door to talk to my neighbor, Gerald Patterson. Gerald was a retired electrical engineer in his 70s who spent most of his time in his garage workshop. His satellite dish was one of the 4 on my roof. "Gerald, we've got a situation," I said, explaining what Brenda had told me. Gerald's bushy gray eyebrows shot up. "She wants you to take them down, but we've had this arrangement for almost 15 years. The previous owner was fine with it." "Yeah, well, the HOA doesn't care about that. They're saying it's a violation." Gerald scratched his chin. "My dish gets me all my European soccer channels. My wife watches her Portuguese cooking shows. We can't just lose that." "I know, but Brenda's threatening $200 a day in fines after 2 weeks. "That's ridiculous," Gerald said. "Let me talk to the other neighbors. Maybe we can figure something out." The other 3 dishes belonged to the Ramirez family directly behind my house, the Chen family 2 doors down, and old Mrs. Kowalski across the street. All of them had legitimate reasons for the setup. Mrs. Kowalski was in her 80s and relied on her satellite TV for company. The Rameyerses had family in Mexico and used their dish for international programming. The Chens watched Mandarin channels to stay connected to their culture. By that evening, I had all 4 neighbors gathered in my living room, and nobody was happy. "This is absolutely unacceptable," said Maria Ramirez, a nurse at the local hospital. "My parents live with us, and they don't speak much English. Their Spanish channels are everything to them. They'd be lost without their telenovelas and news programs." "Can't we just refuse?" asked David Chen, who worked in IT. "I mean, technically we're the ones using the dishes. Zack's just providing the roof space." "The violation is issued to me," I explained. "And the fines would be charged to me too." Brenda made that crystal clear. "So what do we do?" Mrs. Kowalski asked, her voice wavering. She had brought her small terrier, Buttons, with her, and the dog sat on her lap looking as concerned as its owner. "First, I'm going to look into the actual HOA rules," I said. "Maybe there's some wiggle room, and I'll check the paperwork from when I bought the house. The previous owner might have documented the arrangement." Gerald nodded. "And we should all go to the next HOA meeting. Strength in numbers." Everyone agreed, though I could see the worry on their faces. These weren't wealthy people who could just switch to expensive cable packages or streaming services with international content. The satellite setup worked for them, and it had worked for years. The next morning, I dug through my home purchase documents and found what I was looking for. The previous owner, Robert Chen, no relation to David, had left a detailed note about the satellite arrangement. It included written agreements with each neighbor, outlining that they maintained their own equipment and that the arrangement could continue indefinitely. The agreements had been notarized and everything. I made copies and called the HOA management office to request a meeting with the board. The secretary, a tired-sounding woman named Pam, told me the next board meeting was in 10 days, which would be cutting it close to my 2-week deadline. "Can I get an earlier meeting?" I asked. "This is kind of urgent." "The board members have jobs and lives, Mr. Morrison," Pam said flatly. "They meet when they meet. You can submit written comments if you'd like." I submitted a 5-page letter explaining the situation, including copies of the notarized agreements. I thought that would be the end of it. Reasonable people would see that this was a long-standing arrangement that predated my ownership, and that removing the dishes would genuinely harm 4 families. I should have known better. 3 days later, I got a response. Not from Pam, but from Brenda herself, in the form of another letter hand-delivered to my mailbox. The HOA board had carefully considered my submission and remained firm in their decision. The dishes had to go. The letter also informed me that the board had amended my violation timeline. Instead of 2 weeks, I now had 10 days. "They shortened my deadline," I said to my girlfriend Nina over the phone that evening. She was a paralegal at a law firm in Phoenix and had more patience for legal nonsense than I did. "That seems retaliatory," Nina said. "Did you say anything that could have pissed them off?" I just explained the facts. I was completely professional. "Zack, HOA board members don't care about facts. They care about power. You challenged their authority, so now they're doubling down." "So what do I do? Go to the meeting?" "Bring your neighbors. And maybe talk to a real estate attorney. If those agreements were part of your property disclosure, the HOA might not have the authority to override them." I spent the next few days researching Arizona HOA law and learning more than I ever wanted to know about covenants, conditions, and restrictions. It turned out that HOAs in Arizona had broad powers, but they weren't unlimited. If a previous arrangement had been properly documented and disclosed, it could potentially be grandfathered in. I also discovered that Brenda Hutchinson had been vice president of the Saguaro Heights HOA for 6 years and had a reputation. A quick search of local community forums, turned up dozens of complaints about her enforcement tactics. She had issued violations for garbage cans visible from the street 30 seconds after trash pickup, for lawns that were allegedly a quarter-inch too tall, and for holiday decorations left up one day past the HOA deadline. One homeowner claimed Brenda had issued them a violation for having a brown patch in their grass during a drought. The woman was on a crusade against anything she deemed insufficiently suburban and perfect. The night before the HOA meeting, Gerald came over with news. "I did some digging," he said. "Talked to some of the old-timers in the neighborhood. Turns out Brenda lives 3 houses down from you on the next street over. She can see your roof from her second-story window. So this is personal. I think she just hates looking at the dishes. And you know Brenda. Once she decides something is a problem, she won't let it go." The HOA meeting was held in the community center clubhouse, a bland stucco building near the neighborhood entrance. When I arrived with Gerald, Maria, David, and Mrs. Kowalski, the small meeting room was already half full. Apparently, word had gotten around that there was going to be drama. Brenda sat at the front table with the other board members. President Kenneth Walsh, a real estate agent with 2 white teeth, Treasurer Linda Simmons, who always wore too much perfume, and Secretary Jeffrey Brooks, who looked like he'd rather be literally anywhere else. "We'll now hear from homeowners," Kenneth said after they had gone through the standard board business of approving meeting minutes and discussing landscaping contracts. "Mr. Morrison, I believe you wanted to address the board." I stood up, holding my folder of documents. "Yes, thank you. I'm here about the violation notice I received regarding satellite dishes on my roof. As I explained in my written submission, these dishes don't belong to me. They're owned and maintained by my neighbors, and the arrangement has existed for over 15 years under an agreement with the previous property owner." Brenda cut in before I could continue. "Mr. Morrison, the board has already reviewed your submission and made its decision. The dishes violate our architectural guidelines. They must be removed." "But the arrangement was disclosed when I bought the house," I said, holding up the documents. "The agreements were notarized. The neighbors rely on these dishes for their television service." "Then perhaps," Brenda said coldly, "your neighbors should install the dishes on their own properties like everyone else." Maria stood up. "Our property is in a low spot. We can't get a clear signal. That's why the previous owner allowed us to use Mr. Morrison's roof." "We're not here to solve your technical problems," Brenda said. "We're here to enforce community standards." "Community standards," Gerald said, his voice rising. "I've lived here for 20 years. This arrangement was approved by the original developer. It was never a problem until you decided to make it one." Kenneth held up his hands. "Please, everyone remain calm. The board understands this is frustrating, but our covenants are clear. Section 7.3 prohibits visible satellite dishes and antennas except under specific conditions. 4 dishes on one roof exceeds any reasonable interpretation." "What about the FCC's over-the-air reception devices rule?" David Chen said. Everyone turned to look at him. "Federal law protects the right to install satellite dishes. HOAs can't prevent it." Brenda's face flushed red. "That law allows homeowners to install dishes on their own property. These neighbors are using someone else's property. That's not protected." "Actually," I said, "if the property owner gives permission, which I do, then it should be covered." "Your permission is irrelevant," Brenda snapped. "The HOA governs what's acceptable on visible portions of properties. You don't get to make that decision unilaterally." The meeting devolved from there. Mrs. Kowalski started crying, talking about how lonely she would be without her television programs. Other homeowners in the audience began arguing about whether the HOA was overreaching. Someone brought up a violation they had gotten for painting their front door the wrong shade of beige. Someone else complained about not being allowed to plant tomatoes in their front yard. Kenneth finally banged his gavel and called for order. The board's decision stands. Mr. Morrison has 7 days remaining to remove the dishes. If he fails to comply, fines will begin accruing. This meeting is adjourned. We filed out of the clubhouse defeated. In the parking lot, Maria pulled me aside. "Zack, you can't let them fine you. That's going to add up way too fast." "I know," I said. "I'm going to call a lawyer tomorrow." "We'll split the cost," Gerald said. "This affects all of us." The next morning, I contacted Nina's firm and got a consultation with one of their real estate attorneys, a sharp woman named Rebecca Torres. I explained the situation and sent her copies of all my documents. She called me back that afternoon. "This is interesting," she said. "The HOA's covenants do prohibit satellite dishes in most cases, but Arizona law and federal law both create exceptions. The FCC rule David mentioned is relevant, but it's complicated when the dishes are on someone else's property." "So what are my options?" "Well, you can fight the fines. If they start charging you, we can challenge them as unreasonable and not in good faith, especially since the arrangement predated your ownership. But that means going to arbitration or possibly court, which takes time and money." "How much money?" "A few $1,000s, probably. Maybe more if it drags out." I winced. "And what are the odds we'd win?" "Honestly, 60-40 in your favor. The notarized agreements help, and the fact that the HOA is being inflexible about a pre-existing condition works for you. But HOAs have a lot of discretion under Arizona law." After I hung up, I did some math. If the HOA started charging me $200 a day, I'd be looking at $6,000 a month in fines. Even if we won eventually, I could be on the hook for tens of thousands of dollars in the meantime. That's when I started thinking less like a law-abiding homeowner and more like someone who was extremely tired of Brenda Hutchinson's nonsense. I called an emergency meeting with my neighbors that evening. "Here's what I'm thinking," I said. "What if we don't take the dishes down, but we make it so Brenda can't see them?" "How?" David asked. "We build something. A screen, a cover, something architectural that blocks the view from her house but doesn't interfere with the satellite signals." Gerald's eyes lit up. "That could work. Satellite signals come from the south. Brenda's house is to the north. We could build a decorative screen on the north side of your roof." "Would the HOA allow that?" Mrs. Kowalski asked. "The architectural guidelines allow decorative roof elements," I said. I had read every word of the covenants by this point. Things like cupolas, weather vanes, and architectural screens. As long as it matches the house and looks intentional, it should be fine. "So we hide the dishes in plain sight," Maria said slowly. "I like it." Over the next 3 days, Gerald and I designed a decorative screen structure for my roof. We made it look like a Pueblo-style architectural element, matching the southwestern aesthetic of my house. It would sit on the north side of the roof peak, just high enough to block Brenda's view of the dishes, but positioned so it wouldn't interfere with the satellite signals. I submitted the plans to the HOA Architectural Committee, as required. Then we waited. 2 days before my deadline, I got the response. The Architectural Committee, which consisted of Brenda and 2 other board members, had denied my application. The reason given was unnecessary addition that doesn't serve a clear, functional purpose. "Of course they denied it," Nina said when I told her. "They know what you're trying to do. So now what? Now you decide how far you're willing to push this." I thought about it. I thought about Brenda's smug face at the meeting. I thought about Mrs. Kowalski crying. I thought about the $200 a day they were going to start charging me in 48 hours for dishes that weren't even mine. I'm going to build it anyway, I said. Nina was quiet for a moment. That's going to escalate things. Good. Let them escalate. Maybe if I push back hard enough, they'll realize this isn't worth it. The next day was Saturday. Gerald, David, and I spent 8 hours on my roof in the Arizona heat, building the screen. We used materials that matched my house perfectly. By the time we finished, it looked like it had always been there, a decorative southwestern element that added character to the roofline. And from Brenda's house, the dishes were completely invisible. From the street, you could still see them if you looked carefully, but they were much less obvious. The screen didn't violate any rules about heights or setbacks. It was, by any objective measure, an improvement to the property's appearance. On Monday morning, my deadline day, Brenda was back on my driveway. "What is that?" she demanded, pointing at my roof. "It's a decorative architectural screen," I said calmly. "I think it really enhances the Pueblo revival aesthetic of the house. You built it without approval. That's another violation. Actually, I submitted plans to the architectural committee. You denied them, but I built it anyway because I believe your denial was arbitrary and not based on the actual guidelines." Brenda's face went from red to purple. "You can't just ignore the committee's decisions." "Watch me," I said. "And by the way, the dishes are still up there." I met my own personal goal of making them less visible, which should address the supposed complaints about appearance. But I'm not removing them. "Then the fines start today," Brenda said. $200 per day, and I'm adding an additional violation for the unauthorized structure. That's another $100 per day. "Bill me," I said. She stormed off, and I immediately called Rebecca Torres. "They're going to try to fine me $300 a day now. Can they do that?" "They can try," Rebecca said, "but we can fight both violations. The question is whether you're prepared for this to get ugly." "It's already ugly." "Fair point. Okay, I'll prepare a formal response challenging the fines and the violation notices. We'll argue that the screen is within guidelines and that the dish requirement is unreasonable given the circumstances. This is probably going to end up in arbitration." Over the next week, the situation deteriorated rapidly. The HOA sent me daily letters documenting my supposed fines, which were now allegedly up to over $2,000. They also sent a cease and desist letter about the roof screen, threatening legal action if I didn't remove it immediately. I responded to every letter with documentation from Rebecca explaining why the HOA was overreaching. I cited specific sections of Arizona's HOA law, references to the FCC's satellite dish rules, and case law about reasonable enforcement of covenants. Brenda responded by getting personal. She started showing up at my house at random times, taking photos of my property from the street. She issued me a violation for my garbage cans being visible on a non-collection day, even though I had just rolled them back from the curb 5 minutes earlier. She claimed my front yard landscaping was insufficiently maintained, despite my yard looking identical to everyone else's on the street. It was harassment, pure and simple. And I wasn't the only one experiencing it. Maria came over 2 weeks after the meeting looking furious. "Brenda just issued us a violation for our fence. She says it's 6 inches too tall. We measured it when we built it 3 years ago. It's exactly 6 feet, which is the maximum allowed. She wants us to cut 6 inches off the entire fence." "She's retaliating," I said. "Because you supported me at the meeting." "What do? Document everything. Take photos with measurements. Get a professional surveyor if you need to, and don't let her bully you." David Chen got hit next. Brenda claimed his garage door was excessively weathered and needed repainting. even though it had been painted the previous year. Then Gerald got a violation for having a workbench visible through his garage window, which Brenda claimed violated rules about business activities in residential properties, despite Gerald's workshop being purely a hobby. Brenda was systematically targeting everyone who had opposed her, and it was working. David and Maria were both talking about just giving up and figuring out alternative solutions for their TV service. Gerald was more stubborn, but even he was getting tired of the constant harassment. "She's trying to break us," Gerald said during one of our strategy sessions in my garage. "She figures if she makes life miserable enough, we'll cave." "Then we don't cave," I said. "We fight back harder." "How?" Maria asked. "We're not on the board, we can't just overrule her." "No, but we can vote her out. When are the next board elections?" "Not for 8 months, David said. "That's way too long." "Actually," Gerald said slowly, "there's a recall provision in the HOA bylaws. If enough homeowners petition for it, we can force a special election." I pulled up the bylaws on my laptop. Gerald was right. If we could get signatures from 30% of the homeowners in the community, we could trigger a recall vote on any board member. Saguaro Heights had 240 homes. We needed signatures from 72 homeowners. "That's doable," I said. "We just need to organize." Over the next month, we organized. We started with the people who had come to the meeting and were clearly frustrated with the board. Then we went door to door, talking to neighbors about their experiences with the HOA. It turned out Brenda had made a lot of enemies over the years. We found a couple who had been fined $3,000 for planting desert wildflowers in their front yard instead of grass, which Brenda claimed violated the landscaping requirements, despite xeriscaping being encouraged by the state. We found a single mother who had been threatened with a lien on her house because she fell behind on HOA dues by 1 month when she lost her job. We found a veteran who had been cited for displaying an American flag in a manner Brenda deemed excessive. Even though federal law protected his right to display the flag, everyone had a story. Everyone was tired of it. Within 3 weeks, we had 90 signatures. We submitted the recall petition to the HOA board. Kenneth Walsh called an emergency board meeting to discuss the petition. This meeting was packed. Nearly 100 homeowners showed up, filling the clubhouse and spilling out into the parking lot. "The board has received a recall petition targeting Vice President Brenda Hutchinson," Kenneth announced. "Under our bylaws, this triggers a mandatory special election within 60 days. Voting will be conducted by mail-in ballot." Brenda stood up, her face tight with anger. "This is a coordinated attack by a handful of malcontents who want to flout our community rules. I have dedicated 6 years to this board, working tirelessly to maintain property values and community standards. This recall is baseless and vindictive." "You've dedicated 6 years to making everyone miserable," someone shouted from the back. The room erupted. People started yelling about their various grievances with Brenda. Kenneth banged his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order. Finally, an older man I didn't recognize stood up. "I'm Tom Fletcher. I've lived here since this community was built 23 years ago. I served on the original HOA board, and I have to say, this current board has lost sight of what an HOA is supposed to be. You're supposed to maintain common areas and handle community needs. You're not supposed to be the Gestapo, measuring everyone's grass and harassing people about satellite dishes." Applause broke out. Kenneth looked deeply uncomfortable. "The recall election will proceed as required," he said. "Ballots will be mailed next week. This meeting is adjourned." After the meeting, Tom Fletcher introduced himself to me. "I heard about your satellite dish situation," he said. "That's exactly the kind of overreach I'm talking about. The original developer specifically approved that arrangement. I know because I was on the board when it was set up." "Really?" I said. "Do you have any documentation of that?" "I might. Let me check my records." 2 days later, Tom came to my house with a file folder containing meeting minutes from 18 years ago. Sure enough, the original HOA board had formally approved the satellite dish arrangement, noting that it was a reasonable accommodation for multiple homeowners and didn't negatively impact the community. "This is gold," Rebecca Torres said when I sent her copies. If the original board approved it, Brenda's current board doesn't have grounds to revoke that approval without a really good reason, and she doesn't like looking at it isn't a good reason. "Can we use this to stop the fines?" "Absolutely. I'll file for arbitration immediately." With this documentation, I think we can get the fines dismissed and force the HOA to leave the dishes alone. The arbitration hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks later. In the meantime, the recall election went forward. Brenda campaigned hard, sending letters to every homeowner warning about mob rule and the breakdown of community standards. She claimed that if she were recalled, property values would plummet and the neighborhood would descend into chaos. Her opponents, which now included me, Gerald, Maria, David, and about a dozen other fed-up homeowners, campaigned on common sense and reasonable enforcement. We created a simple flyer listing Brenda's most egregious violations and fines, including the satellite dish situation, the wildflower fine, and the flag incident. The flyers resonated. I started getting stopped by neighbors I barely knew who wanted to tell me they were voting for the recall. The arbitration hearing arrived first. Rebecca presented our case to a retired judge serving as arbitrator. She laid out the timeline: the original board approval, the notarized agreements, the disclosure in my home purchase, and the current board's attempt to override all of it without justification. The HOA's lawyer, a nervous-looking young man named Brad, argued that board decisions could evolve over time and that the current board had authority to enforce covenants differently than previous boards. "But that's not what happened here," Rebecca countered. "The current board isn't enforcing rules differently. They're targeting one specific property owner over an arrangement they don't like, and they're doing it in a way that harms multiple homeowners. This is arbitrary and capricious enforcement, which Arizona law prohibits." The arbitrator asked Brenda to explain the HOA's position. She launched into a speech about maintaining aesthetics and property values. "Mrs. Hutchinson," the arbitrator interrupted, "do you have any evidence that these satellite dishes have actually harmed property values?" "It's common sense that I'm asking for evidence. Comparable sales data, appraisals, anything concrete," Brenda faltered. "Well, no, and is it true that you can see these dishes from your home? That's irrelevant." "I'll decide what's relevant. Please answer the question." "Yes, I can see them from my second-floor window." The arbitrator made a note. "And prior to you joining the board, were there any complaints about these dishes?" "I don't know. That was before my time." "According to the records provided, there were no complaints in 15 years until you initiated this violation. Does that sound accurate?" Brenda's face flushed. "Just because nobody complained before doesn't mean it wasn't a violation." The arbitrator leaned back in his chair. "Mrs. Hutchinson, I've reviewed the case materials thoroughly. It appears to me that this enforcement action is personal, arbitrary, and not supported by any legitimate community interest. The original board approved this arrangement for good reasons. Multiple homeowners rely on it. Mr. Morrison disclosed it when purchasing his property, and there's no evidence of any actual harm to the community." He turned to both lawyers. "I'm ruling in favor of Mr. Morrison. All fines are dismissed." The HOA is ordered to cease enforcement action regarding the satellite dishes and the architectural screen. Furthermore, the HOA is ordered to formally grandfather the satellite arrangement, documenting that it's an approved exception to the standard covenants. Mr. Morrison, you're also entitled to recover your attorney's fees, which the HOA will pay. Brenda looked like she was going to explode. Brad, the lawyer, just looked tired. We walked out of the hearing victorious. Rebecca was grinning. That went even better than I expected. The arbitrator clearly saw through Brenda's nonsense. How much are attorney's fees going to cost them? I asked, based on the hours I've put in. Probably around $4,000. I couldn't help but smile. The HOA's petty crusade had just cost them real money. The recall election results came in 1 week later. Brenda was recalled by a vote of 162 to 58. It wasn't even close. Kenneth Walsh called a board meeting to address the results. Brenda showed up, but she looked different somehow, diminished. The smugness was gone, replaced by barely suppressed rage. The recall vote has passed, Kenneth announced. Brenda, thank you for your service to the community. The board will need to appoint an interim vice president until the next regular election. This is a travesty, Brenda said, her voice shaking. You people have no idea what you've done. Without proper enforcement, this community will fall apart. Property values will tank. You'll all regret this. Actually, Tom Fletcher said from the audience, I'd like to nominate myself for the interim vice president position. The board voted unanimously to appoint Tom. Brenda gathered her papers and walked out without another word. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 2 nights later, I woke up at 3 in the morning to the sound of something crashing outside. I stumbled out of bed and looked out my window. Someone was in my yard, messing with something near the side of my house. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and went outside. The motion sensor lights flickered on, illuminating my side yard. Brenda Hutchinson was standing there with a ladder and a cordless drill. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted. She spun around, caught in the light like a burglar. For a second, she just stared at me. Then she looked up at my roof where one of the satellite dishes was mounted. "You ruined everything," she said. Her voice was eerily calm. 6 years of work, 6 years of keeping this community perfect, and you ruined it. Brenda, you need to leave now. Not until I finish what I started." She turned back to the ladder and started climbing. "You're trespassing. Get off my property or I'm calling the police." She didn't respond. She just kept climbing toward the dish. I called 911. "I have someone trespassing on my property, trying to damage equipment on my roof." The dispatcher asked for details. While I was talking, Brenda reached the dish and started trying to unbolt it with the drill. The dish was connected to cables running down to Gerald's house. If she ripped it off, she'd damage the cables and possibly the electrical connections. "Brenda, stop!" I yelled. "The police are on their way." She ignored me, working frantically at the bolts. The drill whined in the quiet night. Lights started coming on in nearby houses. Gerald came outside, then Maria, then David. We all stood there watching Brenda Hutchinson having what appeared to be a complete mental breakdown on my roof. The police arrived 6 minutes later. 2 Mesa PD officers pulled up with their lights flashing. "Sir, what's the situation?" one of them asked me. I pointed at my roof. "That woman is trespassing and trying to damage property that doesn't belong to her." They looked up and saw Brenda still working on the satellite dish. "Madam, you need to come down from there," one officer called up. "Now." Brenda looked down at them. In the flashlight beams, her face looked wild. "These dishes are illegal. The HOA rules say they have to come down." "Madam, that's not a criminal matter. This is trespassing. Come down now or we'll have to come up and get you." Something seemed to break in Brenda then. She sat down on the roof and started crying. "I just wanted the neighborhood to be perfect," she sobbed. "Why couldn't everyone just follow the rules?" It took 20 minutes to get her down. The officers talked to her quietly, and eventually she climbed down the ladder. They put her in handcuffs. "Mr. Morrison, do you want to press charges?" one officer asked. I looked at Brenda. She looked small and pathetic, standing there in handcuffs, mascara running down her face. "Yes," I said. "She's been harassing me and my neighbors for months. This is just the final straw." They arrested her for criminal trespass and attempted criminal damage. As they put her in the patrol car, she was still muttering about HOA rules and property values. Gerald came over after the police left. "That was intense." "That was insane," I said. "What was she thinking?" "She wasn't thinking. She was obsessed." He looked up at the satellite dish. "Is it damaged?" We climbed up to check. Brenda had managed to loosen 2 of the bolts, but the dish was still functional. We tightened everything back up. The story spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By the next afternoon, everyone knew that Brenda had been arrested. Some people were shocked. Others just nodded knowingly, like they had always suspected she might snap. The criminal case moved forward. Brenda hired a lawyer who tried to argue that she had believed she was enforcing legitimate HOA rules and hadn't meant to trespass. The prosecutor wasn't buying it. "Your client climbed onto someone's roof at 3 in the morning with tools to damage property," the prosecutor said at the preliminary hearing. "That's not HOA enforcement. That's vandalism." Brenda eventually agreed to a plea deal. Probation, anger management classes, a restraining order requiring her to stay away from my property and from all HOA meetings, and restitution for my attorney's fees dealing with the criminal case. Kenneth Walsh sent out a letter to the community apologizing for the situation and promising that the board would refocus on reasonable, community-minded governance. Tom Fletcher, as the new vice president, started reviewing all pending violations and canceling the ones that were clearly petty or retaliatory. My neighbors and I finally had peace. The satellite dishes stayed exactly where they were, now formally approved and documented in the HOA records. Gerald watched his soccer. Maria's parents watched their telenovelas. The Chens watched their Mandarin programs. Mrs. Kowalski watched her classic movies with buttons curled up beside her. The architectural screen I had built ended up winning an award at the HOA's annual meeting for Best Home Improvement Project. Tom Fletcher presented me with a plaque, and everyone laughed about the irony. 3 months after Brenda's arrest, I was working in my garage when Gerald stopped by. "I heard Brenda and her husband are selling their house," he said. "Really?" "Yeah. Moving to some retirement community in Scottsdale. Apparently it has even stricter HOA rules than ours. She'll fit right in." We both laughed at that. "You know," Gerald said, "when this all started, I thought we were going to lose. I thought the HOA had too much power and we'd just have to accept it. What changed your mind? You did. You didn't back down. Even when it got expensive and complicated, you stood your ground. That made the rest of us believe we could win too." "I couldn't have done it without all of you," I said. "The signatures, the support at the meetings, all of it. That's what actually made the difference. Maybe, but you threw the first punch. That took guts." After Gerald left, I sat in my driveway and looked up at my roof. The 4 satellite dishes were still there, barely visible behind the decorative screen. They looked like they belonged, because they did belong. They were part of the neighborhood's history, part of the fabric of how this community actually worked, as opposed to how some control freak thought it should work. Nina came over that evening, and we had dinner on my back patio. The Arizona sunset painted the sky orange and pink. "So it's really over?" she asked. "It's really over. No more fines, no more violations, no more Brenda showing up to harass me. How do you feel? Honestly, exhausted. This whole thing took up so much time and energy, but also relieved. And kind of proud, I guess. We actually changed things. You definitely changed things. The whole neighborhood is talking about how the HOA is actually reasonable now. Tom Fletcher deserves credit for that. He's been great as vice president. Turns out when you appoint someone who actually cares about the community instead of just enforcing rules, things work better. Imagine that, Nina said, raising her glass in a mock toast. We clinked glasses and watched the sunset. The next week, Kenneth Walsh announced he wouldn't be running for re-election as HOA president. He said he wanted to focus on his real estate business, but everyone knew the recall election and Brenda's arrest had rattled him. He had enabled Brenda's behavior for years, and now he was paying the political price. Tom Fletcher ran for president. He won easily. His platform was simple: maintain common areas, handle community business efficiently, and stop harassing homeowners over petty nonsense. It turned out that was exactly what people wanted. The new board established clear guidelines for violations. They had to involve actual harm to the community or represent genuine safety issues. No more citations for grass being slightly too long or garbage cans being visible for 5 minutes. No more measuring fence heights with rulers looking for half-inch violations. No more harassment campaigns against people who dared to disagree with board members. It was a radical concept, an HOA that actually served the homeowners instead of ruling over them. 6 months after the whole satellite dish saga began, I was at a neighborhood barbecue when Mrs. Kowalski approached me with Buttons trotting beside her. "Zack, dear, I wanted to thank you again," she said. "If you had given in and taken down the dishes, I don't know what I would have done. My television programs are my connection to the world. You saved that for me. You don't have to thank me, Mrs. Kowalski. It was the right thing to do. Still, not everyone would have fought that hard for their neighbors." She pressed a container of homemade cookies into my hands. "Chocolate chip, your favorite," Gerald told me. After she walked away, Maria came over. "That was sweet. Mrs. Kowalski really was worried, you know. She barely left her house that whole first month, thinking she was going to lose her TV service. I didn't realize it affected her that much." Of course it did. For a lot of us, this wasn't just about TV channels. It was about whether we had any say in how we lived in our own homes. You proved we did. The barbecue was being hosted by Tom Fletcher, and it had drawn nearly the entire neighborhood. Kids ran around playing tag. Adults stood in clusters, talking and laughing. Someone had brought a karaoke machine, and a group of teenagers was attempting to sing pop songs with varying degrees of success. It felt like a real community. Not a list of rules and restrictions, but actual people who knew each other and cared about each other. Tom clinked a glass to get everyone's attention. "I just want to say a few words. When I joined this board, it was because I saw our community losing its way. HOAs are supposed to help neighborhoods thrive, not make people miserable. Thanks to the homeowners who stood up for common sense, we've turned things around. So here's to all of you for making Saguaro Heights a place where people actually want to live." Everyone applauded. I caught Tom's eye and he nodded at me with a smile. Later that evening, as things were winding down, David Chen pulled me aside. "Hey, I never told you this, but during that whole mess, I was seriously considering selling my house and moving. The constant stress from Brenda, the violations, all of it. My wife and I had actually started looking at other neighborhoods. I'm glad you stayed. Me too. This place is pretty great now. And I learned something important. Bureaucrats and petty tyrants only have as much power as we give them." The moment we stood up and said no collectively, their power evaporated. That's pretty philosophical for a IT guy, David laughed. Yeah, well, HOA drama makes philosophers of us all. As I drove home that night, I thought about how close I had come to just giving in at the beginning. It would have been easier to tell my neighbors sorry, take down the dishes, and avoid the whole confrontation. The fines, the lawyer, the arbitration, the recall election, all of it could have been avoided if I had just complied. But then what? Brenda would have kept abusing her power. Other homeowners would have kept suffering under petty, vindictive enforcement. The neighborhood would have remained a place where people were afraid to plant the wrong flowers, or display a flag, or do anything that might draw the wrath of the HOA board. Sometimes the harder path is the right path. Sometimes you have to fight, not because you want to, but because nobody else will. I pulled into my driveway and looked up at my roof one more time. The satellite dishes were still there, still working, still connecting my neighbors to the world. The decorative screen I had built, the one that had caused so much drama, looked elegant in the moonlight. My phone buzzed with a text from Nina. "Proud of you. Come over tomorrow for dinner." I texted back a yes and went inside. The house was quiet and peaceful. No more worry about HOA violations or fines. No more surprise visits from Brenda. No more arbitration hearings or legal bills. Just a regular house in a regular neighborhood, with satellite dishes on the roof and neighbors who looked out for each other. Exactly the way it should be. 1 year after everything started, I got an invitation to speak at a local homeowner rights advocacy group. They wanted me to tell the story of the satellite dish fight and how we had successfully pushed back against HOA overreach. I was nervous standing in front of the group of about 50 people, all of whom had their own HOA horror stories. But as I talked through what had happened, I saw heads nodding in recognition. These people understood. They had dealt with their own Brendas, their own petty violations, their own fights against arbitrary rules. After my talk, a woman approached me. She was in her 30s, clearly stressed. "My HOA is trying to fine me $5,000 because I painted my front door turquoise instead of beige," she said. "I didn't know I needed approval. What should I do?" I told her to document everything, check her state's HOA laws, and consider getting an attorney if the fine was serious. But mostly, I told her not to give up. These boards rely on people being too tired or scared to fight back, I said. If you stand firm and you're in the right, you can win. It might take time and effort, but you can win. She thanked me, and I could see a little hope in her eyes where there had only been despair before. That's what the whole satellite dish saga had really been about, I realized. Not just about keeping some dishes on a roof. It was about proving that ordinary homeowners could stand up to petty bureaucrats and win. It was about showing that communities work better when they're based on mutual respect instead of fear and control. Driving home that night, I felt something I hadn't expected: gratitude. I was actually grateful that Brenda had started this fight, because if she hadn't, I never would have learned what I was capable of. I never would have brought the neighborhood together. I never would have helped change the culture of the HOA from authoritarian to reasonable. Sometimes the worst conflicts lead to the best outcomes. When I got home, there was a small package on my doorstep. Inside was a framed photo of all 4 satellite dishes on my roof, taken from the street. On the back, someone had written, "Thanks for fighting for us, from your grateful neighbors." It was signed by Gerald, Maria, David, Mrs. Kowalski, and about 24 other people from the neighborhood. I hung it in my home office, right where I could see it when I worked. A reminder that standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, even when it costs you time and money and peace of mind, is always worth it in the end. The satellite dishes are still on my roof today. They still work perfectly. My neighbors still rely on them. And every time I look up and see them, I remember the time I went to war with an HOA and won. Not because I was special or particularly brave, but because I refused to back down. Because I knew I was right. And because I had neighbors who stood with me when it mattered. That's the real story of the satellite dishes. Not about technology or HOA rules, or even about Brenda Hutchinson's arrest. It's about a community finding its voice and refusing to be bullied. And that's a story worth telling.